otherwise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Thank you for listening to the FCPA Flash podcast. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and I invite you to my next FCPA Institute in Miami on January 12th through the 13th. To learn more about the two-day FCPA Institute and how it has elevated the FCPA knowledge and practical skills of a diverse group of professionals, please visit fcpaprofessor.com and click on the FCPA Institute chalkboard.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Koehler, and in today's episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Matthew Wagstaff. Mr. Wagstaff is the Joint Head of Bribery and Corruption at the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about some developments in the United Kingdom. Of course, the UK Bribery Act came into force approximately 5 years ago, and one of its most notable features was the so-called adequate procedures defense. From your perspective, what impact has the adequate procedures defense had on UK corporates? In other words, has this legal defense motivated, in your estimation, companies to adopt best practices, compliance policies, and procedures to a greater extent than prior to the Bribery Act?
Thank you. Broadly speaking, I think so, yes. So certainly in the lead up to, and I guess following the implementation of the Bribery Act in 2011, there was a real drive, I think, by many companies to raise levels of anti-bribery awareness, to improve their compliance procedures in a way that I guess we hadn't seen, at least to the same extent, prior to the Act coming into force. So I think in general terms, yeah, I'd want to say that the Act has succeeded in the sense it's given a real boost to corporate awareness of bribery and the importance of having adequate procedures in place. I mean, I guess obviously that's not a universal experience, and that's evidenced by the fact there are companies that we in the SFO have prosecuted, and there are others where we are investigating where it's clear that there are a lack of adequate procedures. We've got around 20 or so active bribery investigations at the moment. Half of those are likely, if they come through to prosecution, to involve charges under the Act. Some of those may well include offences under the Section 7 failure to comply offence. So yes, we have seen that kind of upsurge in the way that I've described just now, but it's clear as well that there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I think as well, just to add to that, there was a report published last year by our Ministry of Justice here in the UK, which was looking at the impact of the Bribery Act amongst small and medium enterprises. And that, some interesting reading there. The headline result was around 2/3 of the companies surveyed knew of the Act and were aware of their corporate liability for failure to prevent bribery. But I guess, as positive as that is, the flip side of that is that there are at least 1/3 of companies there who, on the face of it, remain unaware. So, as I say, lots of good news, but clearly still a way to go.
Yeah, and I recall that report and highlighted it and talked about it on FCPA Professor as well, and I agree it was some interesting findings, on both sides of the coin, so to speak, as to this issue. Now, another recent development in the UK that's not exactly Bribery Act specific, but more general in nature, is the UK's implementation of deferred prosecution agreements. And in a recent speech, you stated that the rationale behind the introduction of DPAs is simple, to use your words. They are intended to avoid lengthy and expensive prosecutions with all the prolonged uncertainty that this can bring for victims, blameless employees, and others who may be dependent on the future of the company. Now, the UK DPA regime, of course, is really fundamentally different, and I think indeed better than the US DPA NPA regime. But the same rationale that you offered for a DPA regime has been really frequently and consistently over the last decade been offered by U.S. officials in justifying alternative resolution vehicles. So I guess my question is, whoever said prosecuting crime, whether against a corporate or an individual, should be quick, should be cheap, or should be certain? And aren't the legal traditions of both the United Kingdom and the U.S. Really different, that it shouldn't be easy to accuse and convict someone of a crime?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. And I think that's why, as prosecutors within the UK, we obviously operate to very clear guidelines which state we can only charge somebody with a criminal offence, whether that's a company or an individual, where there's sufficient evidence to support a realistic prospect of a conviction, and a prosecution is in the public interest. And our default position, notwithstanding the introduction of DPAs, is that where that is the case, so where we have the evidence, where it's in the public interest, we will look to prosecute. We'll look to prosecute corporates, and we'll look to prosecute individuals. So far as DPAs specifically are concerned, the position there is very similar. So we can't offer a DPA to a company where we have no evidence, simply as a means of trying to avoid or get around an investigation. So again, as a minimum, we would need to have reasonable suspicion that an offence has been committed, and that a DPA would be in the interest of justice. Having said all that, however, I don't think any of that detracts from the policy aim of avoiding the cost, the length, the uncertainty of a criminal trial in circumstances where, a company comes to us, as they do, and says, look, we've got a problem here. We admit we've got a problem. We're willing to work with you to get to the bottom of it, put it right. In those circumstances, what a DPA offers is for the ability for a court, and interestingly, Mike, you mentioned in your question, some of the differences between the US regime and the UK regime. One of the major differences, of course, are here in the UK, every DPA requires very specific approval by our court, by a senior judge. So it does mean that a court has that ability to recognise the seriousness of the conduct in question and to ensure that conduct is marked, whether that's by way of financial penalty, disgorgement of the profits, whatever other condition may be necessary or appropriate. But it can do that fundamentally without the cost and the time of a criminal trial. So I think that marks out the difference there.
Yeah, and thanks for your viewpoints on that. And to be sure, if there are going to be deferred prosecution agreements in this world, again, the UK regime is fundamentally different in that, as you mentioned, it requires active and early judicial involvement, which is not the case here in the United States. And I think it also bears mentioning for the benefit of listeners that when the UK was going through this process and deciding whether to implement DPAs, the UK rejected non-prosecution agreements as being, I think the words were, inconsistent with UK constitutional principles. So, that's an interesting difference as well.
Yeah.
A recent guest on my podcast, a UK practitioner, stated that the UK DPA regime is actually a step backwards in his estimation in terms of motivating corporate self-reports, given that, as you also noted in a prior speech, previous guidance by previous heads of the SFO implied that any corporate who approached the SFO to report wrongdoing would be almost guaranteed to receive a civil as opposed to a criminal outcome. What's your response to this criticism that the UK DPA regime may be a step backwards in terms of motivating corporate self-reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that said. I have to say, personally, I wouldn't agree with that. I think the fact that here in the UK we have now secured our first couple of DPAs, I'd suggest that makes it clear that there are still corporates out there who are willing to self-report and who are willing to cooperate with us. I know it's said, well, it's only been 2 DPAs in as many years, but even so, I think that does prove the point. And I think our director has gone on record recently as saying, there will be more DPAs to come. But I think the point, though, is this. The old practice that you refer to in your question there, Mike, and it's worth saying, we are talking, it is an old practice, so this is all pre-2012. But that old practice of offering a civil settlement to a company that came along and self-reported, I think was flawed in a number of ways. It failed to give sufficient weight to the primacy of prosecution. It wasn't particularly transparent. And of course, just touching on our previous conversation, it bypassed the need for any independent assessment as to whether the interests of justice were being met. Now, compare that with the DPA regime that we now have. DPAs recognise serious criminal conduct do merit a criminal rather than a purely civil response. They are fully transparent. We're required to publish in full the details of any agreement that we reach that's approved by the court. And as you've highlighted already, Mike, they do require full judicial approval, and that includes approval both as to the principle of the DPA, whether it's in the interest of justice, and then the specific terms that are to be agreed. So it seems to me, actually, far from being a backward step, it's a much healthier, a much more robust regime. And as I say, we are seeing companies who are coming forward, who are self-reporting, and who are willing to cooperate with us.
Yeah, and of course, just empirically, we know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know, and it's an open question as to whether there would be more self-reports under the old regime versus the new regime, because things have changed. It's really the same issue here in the United States with the DOJ's pilot program that was announced in April of 2016. Well, you really can't measure if there's more self-reporting because many companies were self-reporting even before the pilot program. So your point is well taken that it's very difficult to assess the impact that a policy change may have on corporate behavior.
Yeah, and I recognise that the previous regime, in one sense, it was more attractive to companies in the sense that obviously it involved a settlement that bypassed the criminal process altogether. But I think our fundamental point is, however attractive that might be, actually that was the wrong approach, and DPAs offer a much better, more principled approach.
Yeah, you mentioned the pace of Bribery Act prosecutions as well, and I've written about that in the United Kingdom, and indeed have tried to put in historical perspective that when the United States adopted the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, it took many, many years for there to be a body of FCPA enforcement action. Yeah. And I know many are clamoring for more Bribery Act prosecutions, but the fact of the matter is the Bribery Act was forward-looking only, and many of these investigations, as you well know, including in the United States, generally take on average from 3 to 5 years. So I think, while 5 years is an important anniversary, it's a little bit premature to, declare or to draw any big conclusions. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think that's a helpful point. And you're right. There's been a lot of noise over the last 5 years saying, why isn't the SFO doing more to prosecute under the Bribery Act? But, your points are well made. It only relates to conduct that postdates the coming into force of the Act. Lots of the cases that we're investigating, in fact, relate to conduct that predate the Act. And I guess for some years still to come, we will continue to have prosecutions that are pre-Bribery Act. there's sometimes, I think, this belief that if it's before the Bribery Act, we're not doing anything about it. But actually, we do still have legislation that makes foreign bribery an offence. So, there's still a number of these prosecutions in the wings. And as you say, the cases take a long time. So we have had convictions under the Bribery Act. We've had corporate convictions under the Bribery Act. The Sweet Group obviously was the first of those under Section 7. And I think over the years ahead, we will see many more of these cases.
Yeah, even though 5 years is perhaps a bit premature to make some big picture observations, it's still a meaningful anniversary. And here in the United States, the FCPA is very close to, reaching the big 4-0, 40 years old.
Yeah. And as I think you pointed out, it was a number of years, I think, before the FCPA had come into force, before there was a real body of case law under that legislation as well.
Yeah, to be sure. And, one of the things that I like to think about from a big picture standpoint, and I would value your observation on this, is we want anti-bribery laws, whether the UK Bribery Act or the FCPA, to be successful. There's no doubt that there's unanimous agreement perhaps on that. But what does the definition of success really mean? And I can think of sort of the following ways to define success. On one level, if a law is successful, it's perhaps deterring improper conduct, and over time there would be less, not more, enforcement actions. That's one way of looking at success. Another way perhaps of looking at success is the number of enforcement actions being brought, the number of settlement amounts secured, and that may represent success. And of course, a third way of looking at success, and there may be more ways as well, is what happens when an enforcement agency is put to its burden of proof in an actual contested adversarial proceeding. Those are sort of how I look at success. What, from your perspective, is the best definition of whether an anti-bribery law is successful?
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that necessarily a sort of one-size-fits-all answer to that. And I guess, it's sort of a bit from column A, a bit from column B. I think in the short to medium term, I think you'd expect to measure success, at least in part, as you suggest, by the number of enforcement actions that are being brought, by the number of convictions or other relevant outcomes being secured. In other words, having strong, robust legislation, that's all well and good. But obviously it's only of limited value if it's only rarely being used in terms of people actually being investigated or actually being prosecuted. So, certainly the number of enforcement outcomes, I think, is a key measure. Longer term, I guess, we'd want to be measuring the impact on society more widely. And again, some of the points that you suggested there, has the corporate compliance landscape improved? Has the deterrent effect been such there's simply less corrupt activity going on? And I guess that, if that were the case, then you might expect to see a corresponding decrease in the need for enforcement action taking place. I suppose as a prosecutor, I'd say that's the kind of holy grail which we're after. Although, I might want to question how realistic that is in practice. Just picking up on the last point of your question there, though, in terms of the Bribery Act itself and how successful that's been, I think my successful, but again, I agree, it's still early days. So as I said already, we have seen a number of enforcement actions. Importantly, we've seen the first corporate conviction under Section 7 of the Act. I think that's an important milestone for us. We've got a number of individuals who are currently facing charges, and as I mentioned already, we've got a lot of other cases that we're actively investigating. And I think we have begun to see at least some evidence, it may be largely anecdotal, but some evidence that corporate culture in the UK is beginning to change as a result of the awareness of the Act. So I guess, standing back overall, I'd say, it's positive, but certainly, there's no room for complacency, and there's plenty of work ahead for us.
Yeah, because, even here in the United States, there's, about 2 months left in the 2016 enforcement calendar. And this year already, FCPA enforcement broke a record. There have been more corporate enforcement actions in the year 2016 in the previous 39 years of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And on one level, you could say, well, gee, look at how successful FCPA enforcement is. But on another level, does that represent success if there's more enforcement of this law in the year 2016 than there was in the year 2000, than in the year 1990? It's sort of an interesting way to look at it. But what is not disputed is that it's in everyone's interest, corporate interest, prosecutorial interest, civil society interest, for a law like the Bribery Act, a law like the FCPA, to reduce improper conduct. And sometimes there's struggles that no doubt you have in your job as to how best to achieve that, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think you're right. And in a sense, I mean, it highlights the difficulty perhaps of looking at results just from a particular year. And I guess, I mean, the advantage that you've got in the States is that you can look back, over 40 years of FCPA legislation, and that'll give you a much better picture to the kind of the trends that you're picking up on. As you say, I mean, here in the UK, we've only had 5 years of Bribery Act legislation. It will be an interesting exercise, I think, in 30 plus years' time, if we were to repeat this conversation and to see where we lie in terms of the number of enforcement actions and whether we think we have seen an increase or a decrease and what the causes for that might be. Yeah.
No, these are interesting times to be sure, and I thank you very much for taking time out of your day to speak to the FCPA Flash podcast listeners. Again, this has been Mr. Wagstaff, who is Joint Head of Bribery and Corruption at the UK Serious Fraud Office. And thank you very much again for being a guest today.
Thanks, Mike.